But both of these totalitarian states have arisen from a revolution that was violent.
Yeah,
and then
terrible.
violent leaders took over.
Right.
And implemented an even worse system.
Right.
And I think so V understands that he cannot be the one who leads in the aftermath of his revolution.
And that's like just true if you look at many of the most famous revolutionaries of the 20th century, especially during the Cold War. Like Castro is a great example, right?
Right.
Here is a man who is a radical, who is a revolutionary, who helps topple, you know, this oppressive system, and then himself becomes a dictator.
Yeah, for life, absolutely.
And and I think that's actually, and this is actually a really interesting point because, you know, there's a really good book called Why Civil Resistance Works. And it really does profile how when you have a violent takeover of government, it has a tendency to violently create a new violent system. So it just continues to regenerate violence. Because, you know, if you're thinking about what it might be like to be in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan in the early 20th century, you're talking about ultimate brutality. Like the kinds of things that these kind of violent regimes create are brutal people. Because I think unless, and I've never experienced this, but maybe some veterans have out there who are watching this, but to be in combat, to see people's lives destroyed around you, and Chris Hedges, the political activist and journalist, he talks about this, you know, being a war correspondent, you know, hearing the bombs come down around you, not knowing at any time when your life will be taken, when your family lives are taken, you know, seeing women and children slaughtered, or, you know, in the case of like a fascist state, seeing innocent people being taken or black bagged, as they call it in this series, like seeing those kinds of things over and over. If you're inclined to resist, you're more likely to become to resist with brutality.
Sure.
And it's hard to also, you know, we have this ideal that civil resistance is always kind of peaceful, but like, you know, there's a really great book that came out a number of years ago, I think 5 or 10 years ago, I forget the exact date. I read it in grad school. It's called This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. And it was about the militant side of civil rights in the 60s and really specifically through community defense and kind of stuff. So I think, you know, going into reading V for Vendetta, I kind of already knew that you have these kinds of different kind of protest systems for fighting fascist governments, and you can't really easily separate the radical from the nonviolent, because if you look at history, if you look at Gandhi, for example, there was a radical arm. There was a radical arm of resistance that he kept trying to rein in. I mean, several of his major fasts where he almost starved to death because he refused to eat until the situation was resolved. Several of those fasts were trying to get the radical element under control.
Yeah, absolutely.
In, you know, the American civil rights movement, you have, you know, Martin Luther King Jr.,
John Lewis.
But, you know, you have a lot of peace, you know, a lot of people looking for peace and nonviolent, you know, passive resistance. It's not, when you talk about resistance, it's not just allowing people to plow you over. It is, you know, clogging up streets, it's boycotts, it's sit-ins, and all this other kind of stuff. But he would not have been possible without, I mean, he had an arsenal in his house. This is well documented, well known, because, you know, his house was firebombed by white supremacists.
All the time.
So he had a lot of guns in his house. He wasn't afraid to defend his house if he needed. And he had also other members of his neighbors who did armed patrols around his house. They all took turns protecting one another. But also the Black Panthers.
Yeah.
Which started as a community defense force, primarily because, I mean, white supremacy was terrorism.
Absolutely.
You'd show up in the dead of night and they would drag people out of their houses, kicking and screaming, and lynch them or execute them or tar and feather them or all kinds of other terrible things. Like, how do you deal with the KKK? You get your own guns.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what the Black Panthers was. But of course, the Black Panthers also had a community support side where they gave kids lunches. They organized like peaceful kind of stuff as well. So
transportation to schools.
Right.
Yeah.
So when we think of like resistance and we think, you know, it is, and you see this both in the book and the film, there isn't just a nonviolent component. There's also radical elements to these kinds of things.
Absolutely.
Um,